here, or the cocaine brought me here, or the whatever it was brought me here. Well, it's important to know that that's not really the problem. It's not the cocaine, it's the dopamine. It's not the Loratab, it's the dopamine. It's not the alcohol, it's the dopamine. And where's the dopamine? It's in the brain. So the problem's in the brain, not the bottle. The problem's inside, not outside. Which means that just stopping the drug isn't going to help. If just stopping the drug was going to work, then Prohibition back in the 20s would have gotten the total amount of dopamine produced in the brain to go down just by getting rid of alcohol. Let's see how it worked. So it looks like the year before Prohibition, on average, every man, woman, and child in this country was drinking 2 gallons of pure alcohol every year. And at the end of Prohibition, on average, every man, woman, and child in this country was only drinking 1 gallon of pure alcohol a year. So it looks like on the surface I'm wrong. But were there any other drugs back then that people could have used to substitute for the alcohol? Well, there are plenty of drugs, but there was one in particular that the government was measuring. This is a graph of cigarette consumption from 1900 to 2000. Over on the left, the scale is in hundreds of cigarettes per person per year. So we have a good idea on alcohol consumption and cigarette consumption. We know they both raise dopamine. In science, when you want to see if two things interact, you multiply them. So this next graph is a graph of gallons of alcohol per person times the hundreds of cigarettes per person. This will give us a hypothetical dopamine load produced by both drugs. We don't have data for the Prohibition years because there was no legal alcohol for the government to measure. But look at the difference Prohibition made. The average person got the same dopamine load from both alcohol and cigarettes before and after Prohibition. Prohibition did nothing but get people to smoke more. Another thing you can notice here is that the rate of rise of dopamine went up after Prohibition faster than it was doing before Prohibition. Now, that may have nothing to do with Prohibition. It may have been because, the Depression and the war and things were tougher and people used more dopamine because they were under greater stress. But it could also be that when something's not easy to get, people try harder to get it. Now, this hypothetical dopamine load, just like alcohol use and just like nicotine use, starts to go down after 1970. It really starts to go down after 1980. Well, that could be for a number of different reasons, but primarily it's probably because there was a lot of advertising about how bad alcohol and nicotine was for you. There were big public health efforts for smoking cessation and to get people to stop drinking as much. But let's say we didn't use alcohol and nicotine as much. Well, what did the people with low dopamine do to get the dopamine? Because it's looking like the dopamine load from these two drugs is heading down. Before around 1950, there is no real good data on how many calories each person in this country was eating. There was the Great Depression, and then there were the war years with rationing, so it really wouldn't make much sense because it would be an artificial number. But from 1950 to about 1980, calories were pretty stable. And then as the dopamine load from cigarettes and nicotine went away, the dopamine load from sugar and calories went up. That's pretty coincidental. Or maybe not. A lot of people say that McDonald's is responsible for the obesity epidemic, but maybe smoking cessation is responsible for McDonald's. The point here is, same as the original point, the drug doesn't really matter. If all you do is take away a drug, the addicted brain is going to go back and look for other sources of dopamine. So we need a better idea. We need actual treatment for the underlying disease. Okay, addiction's a disease. But what about all those people outside of this program who don't think addiction's a disease? Or who think that There are the addictions, many diseases, each one different. That's actually the way it is in psychiatry. In the textbook that everybody learns from in psychiatry training, cocaine dependence, alcohol dependence, opiate dependence are all separate diagnoses, and they're considered to be separate diseases. In addition, if you don't use alcohol or some illegal drug, then whatever you're doing that's giving you dopamine isn't addiction. Pathological gambling isn't addiction. Compulsive overeating isn't addiction. And so what that means is that treatment programs get to bring in somebody who's alcoholic. He stops drinking, overeats, gains 150 pounds, and that's thought of as a success. But just like the person who's still smoking after treatment, that person who switched from alcohol to food is at greater risk for relapse and isn't getting the most out of treatment. But clearly, there are different types of addiction. So while we don't want to necessarily pull it apart and say these are different diseases, we at least want to make sure we know which type of addiction somebody has so that we can change treatment. But there's a bunch of different ways to look at that type. Typing just by drug of choice or drug of most common use doesn't seem to work very well. What seems to work better is dividing people by pathology. You saw how the brain works. Can you imagine that if you have a problem in one part of that cartoon diagram, that you'd have a different set of symptoms and a different response to drugs than if you had a problem in another part? Well, that's exactly what happens. Another way to look at this is dividing it by people's history. Someone who's born with a problem in their midbrain reward center and grows up with the symptoms of addiction from their earliest days is going to have a very different kind of addiction than someone who develops it because of age-related changes later on in life. If you're feeling scared or discouraged by anything you've heard, don't be. We haven't talked about the solutions yet. We've just been telling you what the problems are, what the symptoms are, what can go wrong. In the next lecture, we'll talk about how we can change those symptoms and make them better. What you've learned here today is all included in the book Questions and Answers on Addiction. Everyone who was admitted to the program got a copy. Get your family to read it. If your family's having trouble understanding that this is an illness with real symptoms and a real treatment, perhaps the book will help. Thanks again for letting Townsend be part of your journey into recovery. We're glad you're here.